Welcome to North Country Matters. My name is Jenna Boss, and I am a student here at Clarkson University, majoring in social documentation. Today we are hosting a conversation looking at strategies to maintain educational solvency in fiscally challenging times. Joining us is St. Lawrence Lewis BOCES School Superintendent Tom Burns. He will discuss some of the short and long-term strategies school districts can look at to meet the fiscal challenging facing North Country schools. With him today are Ann Carvill, a former Potsdam Board of Education member, and Donna Seymour of the St. Lawrence County branch of American Association of University of Women. Take it away, Donna.
Thank you, Jenna. Tom, it's really nice that you're joining us today. We were together last about a year ago and looking at some of the issues that were facing education, and this year they've kind of fallen on our heads as far as what we had talked about. So even though we have a new state budget that's complete, or at least it will be after the Assembly votes tonight, and we have a pretty clear picture of what state aid is for the next year, nothing fundamentally has changed about the situation in our school districts. They find themselves with no reformed state aid formula. The overall financial situation that we're in as a society is still pretty grim, and schools are trying to continue doing business as usual by draining their fund reserves, and we know that is a dangerous precedent to set. They're cutting staff, often through attrition and retirement, and they're putting off some of the hard choices that we know are going to have to be made. Tom, what are the realistic choices that North Country school districts have, given our lack of property wealth, our shrinking school-age populations, and in some cases we have districts that have more building than they need for the students that they no longer have. All of these things are even exacerbated by the high health care insurance costs and by the high benefits. If our first priority is high-quality education, what do we have to do differently to make sure our school systems are running in a way that optimizes education and yet controls all of those costs?
Mm-hmm. So if I knew specific answers and correct ones to that question, I'd be the highest paid educational consultant in New York State. I guess
you'll just have to take a stab at it.
my crystal ball is as good as anyone's. First of all, let's talk about the funding formula. Based on what we've seen the last few years, I'm not optimistic about aid reform, and there are several problems with that. I think the first problem is that the funding formula itself is inherently unfair. There are several mechanisms within the formula that, at least in North Country schools, we would like to see changed. Mm-hmm. So that's the primary issue. The other problem I think we're finding is that the formula is so complex, and there are very few people statewide that understand it. What that allows is for politics to creep into the process. So what we're seeing is that the formula is manipulated. Not only is it inequitable to begin with, but then it's manipulated, and where it ends up is with the old shares agreement, where certain regions of the state get certain percentages. It happened with this budget, again, just within the last few days, where upon closer examination, Long Island ends up with 12% or 13% of the total monies. And I'm not begrudging them of the monies that they're receiving, but how is it when we've tweaked the formulas and we've built in mechanisms that should drive more monies to low-wealth schools, but that we end up with the same percentages statewide? And I think the reason for that is that, again, when you work that backwards, the formula is being manipulated somewhere. So that's what I would say about that. We have to continue fighting for equity in the formula. We've done that. In the North Country, our local legislators have been responsive. They have been listening, but we have to be realistic about our political clout, statewide, and they're trying to do what they can for us. The negative about that is that they're, haven't even got us back to 2008 levels of aid. So they're, getting us some small increases. We can kind of, basically plug holes in the dike with those monies, and that's great. It does save a position here or there, or certain programs, but it's not enough to fundamentally change the overall predicament. So I think that leaves us with restructuring and sharing and collaborating amongst ourselves. And I think we've talked as superintendents and as with school board members that we have to do that locally. It doesn't seem like help is coming.
We're on our
So
own.
the solutions are going to have to come from within our region, not waiting for something to happen at the state level, you think?
I think so.
Yeah.
I think, again, at the state level it's political, and they have constituencies to represent. New York is a very diverse state,
Yes, it is.
so all of the legislators then advocate for their region, and I think if we want to do something creative that's going to help our region, it's got to come from us.
Tom, I'll take it up here. The current educational model doesn't seem fiscally something that can be sustained. It's just costing too much, and of course monies are being cut. In addition to that, we're hearing about schools being on the cusp of insolvency. So my question to you is, what needs to be done about the current model we're using, and what do you see in terms of insolvency? Where does that fall out for the schools in your BOCES district?
I think, in terms of our model, we're still using kind of a 20th century factory sort of model to run our schools. That was popular in the post-war, in the 1950s era. That's when a lot of our the BOCES legislation and a lot of the ed law governing schools was put together. Certainly, I think when you read about Mark Tucker and you look at the international benchmarking that he's done with other countries, the highest performing countries in the world are organizing their schools along professional lines, not along industrial lines. And so I think there are some possibilities there. In terms of our districts and where they're at in terms of their solvency issues, we have 18 component districts, and I really see them kind of grouped in thirds. A third of those districts are perilously close to the edge of the cliff, as you pointed out, within a few years, either educationally or fiscally insolvent. On the educational side, they won't have a comprehensive high school program that's sufficient for kids, or their financial numbers are showing they're out of reserves, they're out of enough operating funds. I've got about a third of the districts that can go a bit longer than that, maybe 5 to 7 years, and then a third of the districts that maybe can have been wise in their financial planning, were able to utilize reserve funds, and so maybe they make it 10 years. But I think the critical point is when you consider the mechanisms that are in place, primarily the tax cap, that they're all in the same trajectory.
Okay.
They're all headed the same place. It's just going to be a different time frame in terms of when they get there.
Okay.
The destination is the same. It's simply a question of when, not if, at this point.
Exactly.
One of the things that we know that's happened in the last few years here in New York State is that the Committee on Fiscal Equity sued the state, saying that all of the students in the state were not getting the same quality of education. And so in a place like St. Lawrence County and in the North Country, where we have a lot of rural high needs districts, and even in places where our districts aren't necessarily qualified as high needs, we know they still are not flush with cash by any means. We have to take a look at what kind of education our students are getting. Does it compare with the same level of education that our suburban districts, who are not under the financial constraints that we are? Is it the same? Is the education that our kids getting, does it compare that way in state? Does it compare across the nation? And how does it compare internationally with what expected standards are and what are actually deliverables?
Yeah, I think to answer your question in a couple of different ways, to look at where our state ed department is headed, so I think we want to move towards more of a college and career ready standards for students, and I think using a multiple pathways approach. Right now, all of the students basically receive one Regents diploma. There are some different levels or designations of Regents diploma, but we'd like to see multiple pathways for students to be able to arrive at a diploma. And that includes a robust CTE option for career and technical education. If you've seen the Harvard Pathways to Prosperity report, that really brings in your question about other countries where I think you've got some of the Asian countries and the Northern European countries that do a lot better job with workforce preparation. So we'd like to see things move in that direction, and I think the State Ed Department is trying to do that. You know, back to the overall quality, and I'm glad you mentioned the word suburban, because what I don't like to do is frame this in an upstate, downstate way and pit different regions of the state against one another, because I really don't think that's the case. But what I would suggest, you know, the term we use is high wealth and low wealth, you know, communities, and we see a drastic difference there. And unfortunately, you know, it's almost become a segregated system based on socioeconomic class or, you know, region of the state. So in some affluent suburban communities, students are getting, you know, AP courses, many AP courses, multiple foreign languages, you know, enrichment opportunities, many extracurricular activities, and all those opportunities are just drying up for our students. So I don't see a lot of equity there, and in fact I see the gap just continuing to grow.
And that, of course, is something that we're struggling with as a nation in terms of income equity. You mentioned the Harvard study. I was listening this morning to a radio program. It was an interview program, and the point was being made that our current educational system is pretty much on the college readiness program, and it means that in terms of jobs, there are segments in our society where employers can't find people who are qualified to do the work because they haven't had the career training that you were speaking of. And on the other side of it, we have 50% of our college graduates who may not be able to find a job at all, or certainly not find a job in the field that they studied in, or that they even needed to go to college for if they end up in something. So clearly the system is not working the way it needs to work, and so that presumes that there's some redesign that needs to go on.
Right. Tom, I'll take it from that point with regards to school reform. Educational reform often goes hand in hand with fiscal reform, which of course we need to do now. And it seems that in many cases we have managers running schools instead of leaders. Of course, being a leader comes with risk of failure, taking chances, etc. There are visionaries out there like Mark Tucker. And I listened to the same show as Donna today, and one of the things they said is that in Switzerland, 3 out of 4 high school students is involved in programs outside the school during the school day to learn the real world and real tasks. So my question to you is, what are visionaries like Mark Tucker advocating that we do differently? I know you alluded to him a little bit earlier. Can you expound on that?
Well, I really like Tucker's research because they've been working on this benchmarking for 25 plus years, and they've looked at I think 37 countries, you know, essentially the developed countries in the world and the highest performing countries in the world, and, you know, recognizing that there are vast cultural differences among all of those nations, but what they've been able to do is pull out some commonalities. And, you know, I think Tucker's point is that not that we're going to take any of those systems in any of those countries and replicate that, but certainly we should be able to see some of these 6 or 8 or 10 common denominators that the most successful countries are doing, and you know, try to do really what businesses did 10 or 20 years ago with their version of benchmarking. How do we adapt that? How do we do it better here? And it's just interesting, and, you know, I think you know, without going through the entire list of Tucker's items, some of what school reform advocates in this country are doing right now, tying teacher scores to standardized tests, you know, trying to get smaller class sizes, especially at the high school, you know, just some of the approaches we're doing. Tucker is finding the most successful countries are not doing any of those things. So that's a bit of a concern to me. I know, you know, our country is, you know, larger than most of those countries in terms of population. We do have a very diverse, not only state, but our country in terms of the types of students we serve. But I think Tucker has suggested there are ways to do that. Again, organizing along professional lines and not industrial lines, improving teacher preparatory programs and making those more rigorous. And so there's some good information there. I was a history major and specifically European history, so I just find that fascinating. Anyway, let's go in and take a look at that and see what other countries are doing and see if we can replicate that.
But I have a quick point to make to you. Tom, we have known for decades, for instance, that foreign language instruction should begin in the elementary school, where the brain is more adaptable to learn. Despite the fact that we've known this for decades, there's been no change. So with regards to the kinds of changes that maybe should happen, that Tucker suggests we absolutely should be looking at, are you at all optimistic for serious change occurring?
Well, I think in that way the fiscal crisis has actually been helpful because we're not going to have the capacity to continue to do things the way we're doing them. So that in and of itself will create the need for change. But I share your skepticism, and again I think it harkens back to the state being so diverse that every time you try to change something on a statewide political level, you end up running into a constituency that wanted that program or that mandate or that regulation in place. And so when you try to remove it and achieve flexibility or put in place a new program, there's a constituency that's always alienated by that. So one of the points Tucker was very careful to make is that in these highly successful countries, they've achieved educational change by taking politicians out of the mix.
I'm for that.
They established, most of those countries, they have a professional ministry of education where they make long-term decisions about education policy. They leave it to the experts, and they understand that these things will take, I think you mentioned this earlier, 10 or 15 or 20 years. So it's unfortunate we're just tackling it now. Some of these issues we really should have dug into 20 years ago, but here we are, so we need to get going on it.
That brings up 2 points, Tom. Number one, if it's going to take 10 to 15 years to do that, what do we do with all the people that we have failed? All the young people who are going to fall through all of the cracks in our economy and all of the cracks in our education system. So that's a huge issue in and of itself. We could lose an entire generation of young people in terms of their productive capacity because we're not producing an education system that actually dovetails with our economic system anymore. You had mentioned earlier about the World War, how we developed our educational program after World War II. And that actually dovetailed very nicely with the kinds of jobs that we had and the way our economy worked. And as you say, we're still using that model, but we have a completely different economic system now. The other thing that it just strikes me is that one of the reasons that we're in trouble fiscally in this state, and in fact in all states, is because politicians, who I think we all three of us probably agree shouldn't be in charge of some things anyway, have literally made decisions that kicked cans down the road. One of those cans that has been kicked down the road that is coming to haunt us now is the way we provide benefits in this country and the way we fund or don't fund retirements. And I mentioned at the outset that one of the things that districts are really, really struggling with now is they're very soon going to be spending more in benefit packages than they do in wages. I mean, they've got these large groups of retired people they're still responsible for. I know the governor has come up with what he calls a pension smoothing plan, which I think Ann informs me instead of 25 years is now a 10-year plan, which is good. But Syracuse Mayor Stephanie Miner has called the governor's plan just another attempt to kick the can down the road that will only create another set of problems once the current set of politicians perhaps are no longer either in office or in New York State. And the governor counters that poor decisions made by those governing bodies led to the current situation. So districts are really caught between decisions that were made a long time ago by policies that in many places were put in place by politicians who are now screaming, well, we can't afford that. So how much of what districts, the pinch that they're in financially is through that kind of decision making, and are there any long-term solutions to that problem of of wages and benefits that districts are going to have to really look at carefully in order to get out of the mess we're in now.
Mm-hmm. You know, Ann mentioned that people are, when confronted with this situation, they're managers and they're leaders. And unfortunately, with the fiscal situation, you know, we've all had to do more with less. So a lot of our school administrators will say managers, they're struggling with the daily weight of their duties. They are, I think, you know, being successful in not losing this generation of kids. They're doing what they can in the short term to get some economic relief, get some fiscal relief, still provide those opportunities for students. But again, they're not getting at the long-term structural issues. And, you know, school leaders, like other systems, they work within systems and existing regulations and laws. And so I think you touched on it in terms of some of these were statewide policy level decisions that were made decades ago that have just been rolled forward, and we're kind of suffering the ill effects of those. And I guess on the local level, yeah, there have been times where probably, you know, we've made parochial decisions that, you know, were short-term fixes. But I think really what this comes down to, and I think you touched on it, Donna, is demographics is destiny, as a colleague of mine likes to say. And so when all of these labor laws were written, when all of these labor contracts were first entered into, when schools were designed, when we talked about the 1950s, you had many active employees compared to each retiree. I know most school districts now in the region are approaching one active employee for every retiree, and it's not going to be long when the rest of this bubble of baby boomers proceeds through the system into retirement, that we will actually have, the retirees will exceed the active population. So we've got to look at redesigning that. And again, I think, well, Montgomery County in Maryland, and I think the Los Angeles Unified School District, they've done some new types of labor contracts that I think are, you know, take some of these things into account. We'll have to look at that, you know, because we can't design these systems that were intended for 1900, 1950, when the number of active employees versus retirees has flip-flopped completely. And of course, the retirees are living longer. That's a great thing. They're healthier, but that means they stay on our health insurance rolls that much longer. And health insurance has gotten so much more expensive. When we hired teachers in the 1970s, they were earning $5,000 to $7,000 a year, and their health insurance plan probably cost $5,000 a year, and now it costs $20,000 for a family health insurance plan, and so we're no doubt we're struggling under the weight of that.
You know that I'm glad you say that we actually have to look at that system, because of course it's not something we have to look at just in terms of certainly in terms of our educational program either. It's really a society-wide one. And one of the, talking about healthcare, I'm sure a number of the countries that Mr. Tucker speaks about and that he's looked at have universal healthcare that is single payer rather than for profit. So that almost looks like a fundamental change that we're going to have to look at in terms of these other pension areas as well. We can't just talk on the labor side of things without talking on the expense side of things when it comes to things like delivering health care.
And I think it's interesting to note that in the course of 10 years, the cost of the teacher pension has gone, in New York State, has gone from approximately 2% of the total amount paid to teachers in your school district to 16% approximately. That is a huge growth in 10 years. And so it's unsustainable, and you know, as you mentioned, you will get to a tipping point where when the retirees exceed the actives, it will implode. So
fiscal unsustainability may be much bigger than educational unsustainability in terms of actually pushing us into doing something.
Right.
As much as we want to do a good job educationally, we may not have any choice about looking at contracts and looking at labor agreements and all kinds of things like that.
Tom, you said that it looks like we're going to have to solve a lot of our problems locally, and that makes sense to me. some districts are not suffering. A friend of mine who's a teacher, her school district down near New York City has not had to let any teachers go, and she was astounded to hear the percentage that Canton had to let go in Potsdam, which I think is about 15%. Based on your expertise, would you talk a little bit about ways that we can reorganize and manage some of these things that are ahead of us, from traditional mergers and things along those lines? What do you think is ahead of us, and what can we do?
I mean, we have some legal options that are available to us now. You've heard the word merger, which really is a centralization, is the more common term, and there are annexations and different types of school reorganization that are currently in the ed law that are allowed. There was actually an article in the Times-Union this morning, letter to the editor from John Sipple, who's a professor at Cornell, and really this is his bailiwick, this is his area of expertise, and he's pointing out that because the governor has made recent comments, well, you'll just have to go consolidate. And, it sounds very simple, right, when you say it that way. And I think Professor Sipple points out that there were 11,000 school districts around 1910, and we have, using these legal mechanisms, we've gotten down to the current approximately 700 districts. But I think, John Sipple was very accurate in pointing out that, now that's become a 60-year-old mechanism for doing this, and as you point out, society has changed. One of the issues is that to do a merger like that, several different referenda are required throughout the process, and that creates many problems. I mean, if you think about mergers and how they must have occurred in the 1940s and 50s in this region, they probably had town hall meetings and got the word out by word of mouth or through paper. Basically, there was no social media. So I'll blame James Madison for this, which is I think Madison was dead wrong about factions. He was right in the 1780s, but he's wrong today because I'm sure the founding fathers never foresaw the social media and the fact that you can have factions, you can have minorities of people in these communities that can communicate very rapidly, and so you can get factions that can override a referendum, and they have within the current merger law several opportunities to do so. And you have to do these referenda in each school district. You can't do an area wide. So again, it becomes much more possible for minorities in different communities to basically stymie a vote at any particular. So that becomes a real issue. The other piece I think John Sipple pointed out with consolidation is that the savings are not always there. You end up throwing a lot of state taxpayer money at the problem. You do enhance opportunities for kids, and in some ways you're able to stabilize the tax levy. So back to your kicking the can down the road, we have one school district in this region that merged recently. Most of them did a consolidation in the 50s, Edwards-Knox, around 1985. So Edwards-Knox is not really in a different place than any of our schools right now. They're a slightly larger yet still underfunded school district. So the consolidation piece, it may work for some schools. The other issue we have in this county is tax rates. We have very differing tax rates, and there are certain communities that, again, unless that law is tweaked or changed, you're not going to have a district that has a $13 per thousand tax rate merging with a district that has a 25. They're going to spend all of the incentive money on leveling up the tax rates, and in some cases they won't even be able to do that. So I think that begs the question of what are the other options? What else can we do?
Speaking of Edwards-Knox, I remember that process that Edwards-Knox went through, and it was a long process because there was so much individual community identity that had been bound up in those two very rural school districts, and it took a long time to get over that. And I know I was reading an article just this week about some school mergers that had happened downstate, and the comment was made that the kids did just fine. It was the adults in the community who were having a great deal of difficulty getting over the idea that a school had merged. We see what's going on in Chicago, where the Chicago City School District's talking about closing 50 schools, and they're actually putting barricades up in front of schools because they're so worried about angry people coming into the meeting, and they don't want to have people getting too close to the buildings. There's a tremendous amount of resistance that has to be overcome when we look at those kinds of things. Is there something that, are there mechanisms out there that we might look at that would preserve community identity and perhaps take away some of this fear? And it really is fear that is driving the idea that if your school closes and your kid goes down the road an extra 15 miles, your society will collapse within your community. I mean, it clearly doesn't happen, but there's still that tremendous fear of that. So would a regional high school help to meet that expectation in a different way?
I think it could. The state ed department has proposed legislation on that. Senator Kathy Young out in Western New York has, and so that's been in the works for several years. The regional high school legislation has passed in the Senate, hasn't passed in the Assembly yet. The governor's office seemed at least interested in the concept, and so I think on our state level, that's one possibility. When you look at it, it would enhance opportunities for secondary school students. And we have an issue with enrollment. Even if the financial problems were to go away tomorrow, we have very small school districts, and our enrollment has decreased by over 10,000 students in the region in the last 30 years. So some schools, regardless of finances, are already, even before the financial crisis, and will continue to have a problem putting together a comprehensive high school program, like what we were talking about earlier, that encompassed multiple pathways and had workforce preparation. So I think the regional approach would allow some of the small school districts to partner, to come together at an agreed upon site. We've talked about in this region, when you have 10,000 students leave over 30 years, the one thing we have is space. We have space out in the current 18 component school districts. So we wouldn't have to build an $80 million brand new high school. I don't think this would encompass any new buildings whatsoever. So I think regionally we've thought about that. Statewide they're thinking about that. There's legislation that's at least been proposed. And I guess that segues into how are other people doing it. And when I look at other states and other countries and some very close neighbors, Ontario, and in that high performing countries study, Canada's about number 8. So they're outperforming us, and they're spending less. And when you look across the border to Ontario, they employ regional high schools. They keep their local communities and their local neighborhood elementary schools in place, so that the community still has a school, still has a vested interest, but they can share on a wider level in terms of secondary school opportunities. So, and I think if you look in other parts of our country, they have county-wide school systems. Again, I would point to Maryland, because Maryland just passed us in the Education Week study. Massachusetts has been first in school performance for a long time. We were second, and then this year Maryland bumped us. And there's a county in Maryland, Montgomery County, where they've done an exceptional job of this, organizing on a countywide level. And about 10 years ago, they had a superintendent, Jerry Wiest, who went into Maryland and really looked at both the funding and the equitable factors amongst the schools in Montgomery County and the school performance. And what he was able to do on a countywide level was put the best teachers and more resources toward disadvantaged students and communities within that system. And
to level it up.
That's right. And what they found they were able to do in a more efficient way is to improve performance for every child in that county. The high-performing schools remained high-performing, but by diverting resources and staff, they were able to raise the achievement levels in the underperforming. counties. And so I think obviously that's what we'd like to see here is, you know, to have children on a county-wide level have access to better programs, more opportunities, and raise the achievement level for everyone in a way that is affordable.
And I think you're right that if we could keep elementary schools and children local and have the older students go to a more central location, that would alleviate a lot of the community-based dissolution fears that people have, that somehow they're no longer, that there's that tie. When your kids leave a community, you feel like you've lost your center, and I think that's very understandable. You had mentioned about the difference between high-performing and low-performing in terms of financial schools, and when we had Ann and I had this discussion earlier this winter with Assemblywoman Russell, she had suggested to us that the poorer rural districts and the urban districts share many of the same financial problems because of lack of underfunding, which some of the suburban schools don't. And she had suggested that we need to do a better job of outreaching to other districts in a similar situation. If 60% of the districts in this state are in trouble financially, we don't have 60% of our state legislatures all working together on this problem. So we know, as you mentioned before, in terms of the internet age, distance isn't a barrier anymore. People are able to communicate. How can we build those partnerships to look at some of these issues across these lines that we see? I mean, a poor rural district might not seem like it has a lot in common with a poor urban district, but in fact they have a lot in common. How do we build those relationships and those lobbying efforts to actually get the attention we need in Albany to look at these issues?
Yeah, and I think Addie's right about that. She's been a very passionate advocate for us. And I think Addie's been realistic. You know, being in the Assembly, it's Democratic controlled, and you know, it's an urban controlled legislative body. So there's probably not much that Addie and her upstate colleagues can get accomplished without somehow including cities in that. And I think she's also right on the poverty issue, which is that our students have a lot in common with New York City students and other urban students. So I think in terms of looking at the school funding formula and maybe pieces of legislation that would advantage you know, students with poverty backgrounds, yeah, that's the way to get at that, you know, is to look at that not in a regional way. Where do, you know, how many students are we talking about? And it is a statewide problem. In terms of reorganization, that becomes more complicated. You know, that's where we don't have much in common with New York City. So I think, you know, in terms of reorganization, we've talked about maybe doing local pieces of legislation, maybe some home rule type legislation, pilot program that would just be for St. Lawrence County, that would help our schools, wouldn't harm any other districts around the state. But again, New York City is not going to be able to reorganize in the way that we need to. So, yeah.
Tom, how do you deal with the issue of resistance to change? People get so entrenched about doing business as usual. And one example I'll make, and it ties in with what you were saying earlier, is the whole notion even of virtual learning, online courses, and especially in a rural area like this. For instance, Potsdam Central lost its Latin program. If we had a Latin teacher who could then educate students in the North Country virtually, virtual learning is better than no learning. So my point to you is, how do you deal with the issue of people being intransigent and nervous about change and highly resistant to it, to be frank?
So the current context with our financial challenges, again, is going to drive some of that. When people are resistant to change, you know, and what I like to ask folks is, you know, if we do the same things, if we put the same inputs in, we're going to get the same results. And so when people are opposed to looking at new ways of doing things, you know, I like to ask them, well, you know, how is doing it the way you're doing it now working? How's that working for you? Because we know, you know, right, with our current numbers, you know, financially that's scary. That doesn't play out very well. We know what the end game is going to be there. I find it ironic in one sense because when we talk about consolidating and sharing and et cetera, and you hear people in the local district saying, we can't do that. We can't do anything with the town next door. The ironic thing is they're all sitting in merged districts
right.
that in fact did do that
That's
in
right.
the 1940s
That's right.
and 1950s. So we've done it before, and I think we can do it again. But as I said, I think the consolidation laws are about 60 years old. So let's update those. Let's think about a new, better way of doing it.
We don't have the right tools in our toolbox right now, do we? That's really the problem. We don't have the tools we need to meet the challenges that we're facing in terms of how do we reorganize. And that's certainly not just true in education. I mean, look at the way our economy is not responding to the traditional inputs that have been tried since 2008. And we're no better off now than we were then, and in some cases we're much worse off. So I think that is, it's a good example to use, and I would really like to see St. Lawrence County try a couple of experiments to make, to see if we can find a new path. And I'm sure you have some superintendents in your BOCES district that are willing to try that.
Can I just jump in here? We're kind of running out of time, so maybe we could toss the ball to you for some wrap-up comments about what you've said today and your thoughts.
Well, I'm glad you acknowledged the efforts of some of the superintendents and the school board members, and because they really are thinking deeply about this. And back to your previous question, how do we message this? How do we get this change? It has to be about students. We know we're having financial problems, but ultimately this is about kids. And I was a graduate of a North Country school. I attended Norwood Norfolk, and those of us that are local, we like the way of life here, and it's very quaint. And many of us came back here to raise our families, but we can't preserve that unless we change. And we always want better for the next generation. So when I hear people say, well, I graduated from Herman DeKalb in 1965, and that was good enough for me, and it's good enough for my children. What I would say to them is, it's not really about you, it's about your kids, and the education that we all received isn't good enough for our students today. We need a different type of education. So it's got to be about the students. And I think we should do some outreach to kids, to students, because I mentioned social media earlier. Now, we didn't know that many students from neighboring districts when I was growing up. Kids today know everybody all over the county. They're already interacting with other students. We have over 1,000 students every day that come to our tech centers and work with other students, and they love it. They don't have any issues doing that. So let's make this about students and what they want and what they need.
So in many ways, you're piloting the regional high school through the BOCES Center. And
every day.
So it wouldn't be that big a stretch to take that model and put 2 or 3 districts together in terms of making sure we could have a Latin teacher or whatever.
Right.
So,
thank you so much for coming over here to Clarkson University. We appreciate it very much.
Well, thanks for inviting me.
Thanks, Tom. It's always exciting, and it's always fun to hear what else is going on. And we did this last year, and it looks to me like next year we'll be back with maybe some more concrete, some proposals that have actually gotten into real life, and that will be great.
All right. Thanks for being here today. That's going to wrap up our show for today. These conversations are a production of North Country Matters. From the production here down on WCKN Studios here on Clarkson University campus, these conversations are a civic collaboration between the St. Lawrence County branch of American Association of University Women, the St. Lawrence County League of Women Voters, and the Mass Media and Communication students here at Clarkson University. Thank you for watching.